want to let you know that we discovered a great historic site in Dixon County called Promised Land. It was settled by United States colored troops and former enslaved people after the Civil War. Had a wonderful tour of the historic school and bought a few things in the gift shop. Wish you were here.
Hello. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to another wonderful session at the Southern Festival of Books on behalf of Humanities Tennessee. We want to thank some of the festival's sponsors, including the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, Ingram Content Group, Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and of course, Parnassus Books. If you are watching today on Facebook Live or on YouTube and you have questions for the authors during the session, you will need to switch over either to the festival's app, which you can download in the App Store on your whatever device you're using, or you can go to their website, which is humtn.org/SFB, Southern Festival of Books. And then there's a chat there where you can ask questions for the authors at the end of today's session. We want to mention that Parnassus is our beloved bookseller for the Southern Festival of Books. And your purchases of the books being debuted this weekend at the festival help keep this festival free. You will be able to find a link straight to their online store in the chat so you can purchase the book we'll be talking about today or any of the other books that you hear about this weekend. I know that your reading list is probably growing long by this point. The festival, as you know, is free. It's a nonprofit organization. And another way that we keep this free for all attendees is through donations, through people who attend. And so if you are enjoying the festival and you want to make a donation, you can also do that at Humanity Tennessee's website, humtn.org. And there should be a link in the chat to the donation page as well. Today, we are here with Michael McRay and Joe Barry talking about Michael's newest book, I Am Not Your Enemy, from Herald Press. Michael is an author, educator, and facilitator who uses the power of personal stories to heal harm, make meaning, and create connection. He's a story consultant with Narrative 4, as well as the storytelling leader, and he's the host of the long-running live storytelling event 10 by 9 Nashville. He holds a master's degree in conflict resolution and is currently completing his execution certification in public narrative from the Harvard Kennedy School. He's joining us from Nashville, where he lives with his family. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Christy. Good to see you.
I'm also joined today by Joe Barry, who is one of the people whose story is collected in Michael's book. Joe is an international speaker who works to resolve conflict around the world. She's the founder of the charity Building Bridges for Peace, which believes and advocates that unbounded empathy is the biggest weapon we have to end conflict by seeing the humanity in others. Joe is also a restorative justice facilitator, a TEDx speaker, and a visiting fellow with the University of Nottingham, and she's currently busy writing her own book. She's joining us today from England. Hi, Joe.
Hi, wonderful to be here.
Hi. So to get us started, Michael, I thought you could read a little bit from your book and give folks who are just now tuning in a little information about what it is.
Yeah. Well, it's a real delight to be here. I want to apologize in advance if you hear some background sounds. I have 2 dogs and a 5-month-old baby downstairs, so you never know what's going to come up. So this book, I'm Not Your Enemy, really for me is a book about a search for stories that might save us. I wanted to write a book that chronicled my travels through places of deep division. Israel, Palestine, Northern Ireland, South Africa, places that when we hear their names, we think of division. And I wanted the stories that I chronicled there to do two things specifically. One, to cultivate empathy, to help us see something in a way that we otherwise might not see it. And then also to tell the truth about the world. And I think part of the truth about the world is that the world is broken and breaking and full of bereavements and burdens and tortures and terrors. And these things are true. And I think they're very alive for a lot of us right now. And as we're, and I know in my country, we're in a sense of panic and fear about a lot of things right now. But this is only part of the truth of the world. And another part of the truth is that the world is full of beauty and friendships, unexpected friendships of ordinary people doing extraordinary things like Joe Barry, who we're going to hear from soon. And I wanted to feature these stories as well to remind us that there's more to the world than simply the pain of the world. So I'll read just a very brief thing from the introduction that gives you a sense of where the book goes and what it's about. The people and stories in this book can help us. They can show us not just where to look, but how to look. They orient us toward hope. In these pages, we hear from a Palestinian peacebuilder about the dangers of dialogue that doesn't lead to freedom. We hear from a community-centered director on what to do when trauma is stuff of routine rather than stuff of memory. A former Israeli soldier teaches us to name what is wounded rather than ignore the pain. And a mother who lost her son shows us how to refuse vengeance. We meet a lover of Shakespeare who created a haven for beauty for those on the margin. And we encounter people who craft way stations of refuge for those in need of shelter. We hear how a woman made space in her life for the man who murdered her father. From a youth worker, we learn that reconciliation may mean little if it doesn't address the surrounding systems of inequality. From a community theater director, we hear of life under oppression and the journey to let go of the hatred that plagues us like poison. And from two bereaved fathers, we are invited to imagine how we might meet devastating loss with grief and action. Theirs are the stories that might save us. Save us from believing that violence must be met with violence. Save us from believing that our belonging will be complete only when we take away someone else's. Save us from the prejudice that makes us predators. Save us from the myth of single stories. Save us from thinking that more guns and more walls and more armies can save us. They are the stories that might save us from our fear. And so one of the stories that I thought could save us is the story of Joe Barry. So I first heard about Joe Barry, I don't actually remember when it was, but it was through a documentary called Beyond Right and Wrong that featured a lot of stories from across the world, and Joe's was one of them. And I remember reading in my study of conflict resolution and peace building that one way to talk about violence is that it's a disruption to narrative. And this is really true in the story of Jo, that she was the daughter of a member of the British Parliament and had a story that was unfolding in a way that you might expect and other ways that you might not expect. But then a bomb went off in 1984, October of 1984, that killed her father. And that bomb was planted by a man named Patrick Magee, who was a member of the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, which is a paramilitary group in Ireland fighting the British. And her story was one about a person who was pushed to the edges of herself and had to find a new way to be with herself and with her story, to reconstruct her story in a way that she didn't expect she'd have to. And it wasn't just the drama and the trauma of her story that drew me in. It was what she did with her pain and how she spent years cultivating within herself the capacity to not just sit with Patrick Magee one day, which she did in the year 2000, but to be able to listen to him with curiosity and openness and empathy. And so her story is one of meeting Patrick in 2000, and now over the last 20 years, they have spoken together over 400 times about how it is that we can live with the people that we find difficult to live with, how it is that we can cultivate an imagination of the world where there is no other, where we can actually look into the eyes of the person that killed our loved one and be able to say to them, I am not your enemy. And so I'm so thrilled that Jo was able to join us today to be able to talk about her story.
Great. Michael, you mentioned this just a moment ago, but the stories that you have collected in this book focus mostly for us on international conflicts in Israel, Palestine, South Africa, and Northern Ireland, rather than conflicts in our home country of the United States. Was that intentional, and how do you decide on that as the scope for your book?
Yeah, it was really intentional. I think, one of the things that often happens for people is that we get kind of stuck in our own stories, and we can develop sort of patterned ways of thinking about our stories because we live with them all the time. And so there can be things about our stories that we can't see, that we don't notice anymore, that we're blind to. And so sometimes we have to encounter the similar dynamics of our stories, but in other places. In literature, they call this defamiliarization. I love the Russian word for it, which is ustranение, which means otherworldization. So that we have to take our stories, but put them in other worlds, so that disruption to what's expected helps us see with new clarity and new wisdom the truth and reality about our stories that are around us. And so instead of just telling stories of division in the United States, when we've become biased in the ways that we might think about those, I wanted to go to other places where we know that there are places of division, but we may not know the stories fully, and let those stories play out, stories that are very similar to the stories of our past, the stories of our present, the stories of what's coming for us, so that we could actually see with new wisdom the wounds of our own place. And so that's what I hope that the book is able to accomplish.
Throughout the book, Michael, and in your story specifically, Joe, you use the language of dehumanization and rehumanization. Would you explain a little bit about what those two things look like and how they are related to the work of peacebuilding?
Joe, please, why don't you answer first?
Okay, well, I'll take you back to 1984. And when my father was killed, I knew it was the IRA, and the IRA at that time were completely demonized. And there was no way I could understand their story or understand why they wanted to use violence. And for me, at the moment the bomb went off, I felt like I had an enemy. Before then, I hadn't. And I didn't want an enemy in my life. So was it 2 days later, I decided I was going to understand why someone would join the IRA. Why would someone plant a bomb at a hotel and kill people? It was important for me to hear the story. Now, back in '84, there was no way to find that out. I even traveled to Belfast right in the middle of the conflict to try to get answers, but it's very hard to hear because at that time I was seen as an enemy. I was English. I came from the other side. It was quite a dangerous place to go. So it was only when we had the peace process that everything changed for me. And I wanted to meet Patrick to see his humanity, to hear his story. I didn't go for an apology. I just went to look into his eyes and see him as a human being, because that was going to rehumanize something inside myself, something that the bomb had taken away from me. I saw that meeting as a one-off. I'd met other men in the IRA, and I was quite sure that one conversation would be enough, and I would get what I wanted, and then I would go, and nobody would ever need to know. But that first meeting, something happened, and Patrick himself started on a journey. He came to that meeting thinking that what he'd done was part of a military battle, that he was justified, and he demonized the people in the hotel. He demonized my father. He could only plant that bomb because he didn't see human beings there, and that is the nature of violent conflict. When he met me, he began to realize he killed a human being. So my dad came back into the conversation, and because he had this moment where he was disarmed by my empathy, that's how he later spoke about it, I knew we had to carry on meeting. There was more there. And so he changed from being the man who killed my father to the man who I was speaking with. So I was changing the story. And now I do call him my friend. I mean, we've got lots of shared experiences together. We've been to Rwanda, we've been to Palestine and Israel. We've been to places where he's the only person I know. So I've changed the story completely. And yet he is still the man that planted that bomb. That doesn't go away.
Well, Michael, did you want to share anything as well?
Well, I'd just say, that I think one of the first casualties in conflict, I often say, is nuance. And so whether that's in an interpersonal conflict I might have with my wife, or a macro conflict, that we begin to we lose all nuance to our arguments and to our ways of thinking about the other. People become one thing. And when we reduce people or ideas to kind of a monolith, something single, that's the process of dehumanization, because people are complex. Even if we don't want to believe that they are, we're all complex. And so in conflicts, we typically dehumanize people, because once we dehumanize people through these single stories about them, it becomes much easier to do the harm that we need to do. And so there actually in the book, and there's a scale of sectarian danger I identified that comes from Joe Lifty and Cecilia Clegg, that talks about how in conflict we can move from really important and innocuous statements like "we are different and we believe differently," but we move down this scale over time in conflict till we finally get to the 11th point, which is "you are demonic." And when we are at that place, that's when people place bombs, and that's when people shoot each other. And so part of the reconciliation process, part of the peace building process, is how we come back to, as Joe's saying, to be able to see the humanity, not just in the other, but within ourselves as well. Because when we commit those acts of violence, we destroy some part of the humanity that's within us.
Yeah, that's so true. And my experience of peace building in Northern Ireland is that I can have empathy with all the different sides. And I know with Patrick, I've reached a point where if I lived his life, would I have made the same decisions he made? I don't know. And then at that point, there is no other. And I think othering starts whenever I start thinking I'm right and you're wrong, and I'm hurting. I want to blame someone and make someone responsible. And that starts demonization that can grow and grow and grow. So for me, this work is a daily task. You know, can I feel outrage and pain and grievances without making anyone else wrong? You know, and that's hard emotional work.
Yeah, you talk in the book, in the story that you relay to Michael when the two of you met in Ireland, about the emotional work that you did on yourself before you first met with Patrick. Michael describes this process as building a firm foundation on either side of the shore before you can build a bridge between yourself and your so-called enemy. Can you talk about what that process of emotional healing looked like for you, and why you believe it was an integral part of your peacemaking journey?
Well, it's great to reflect. That's what it was. At the time, I had no idea what I was doing. And now I'm trained, and I do a lot of restorative processes, and some with homicide cases in prison and all sorts. And there's a whole process people go through before you'd ever bring two people together where there's huge pain. But there was nobody to work with me. And at that time, even though I did try, nobody wanted to be part of such a meeting, because it was seen so early on in the peace process. But I'd done my own inner work. And I always say that I was just about ready for it. You know, like I wasn't really ready, because how can you be ready for such a huge thing as meeting the guy who's killed your father? It's just so massive. But I knew from, as I said, from day 2, that I didn't want to use my pain to blame anyone. I didn't want to use my pain to hurt anyone. I didn't want to go for revenge. So all those years I was learning to be with my emotions. And there was a time when I got a lot of support. And that was about the year before I met Patrick McGee. And during that year, I did lots of releasing emotions and crying, but I didn't use my emotions to make Patrick more wrong. I didn't use them to want to hurt him. And that was about actually watching my thoughts, because I did find when things got difficult in my life, and I've had a lot of secondary trauma, which often happens in this kind of like huge conflict afterwards. And there were times when I wanted to blame him and say he's the reason why this is happening. But that would have got me back in a cycle of violence again and revenge. I wanted to end that cycle of violence and revenge. So a lot of it was about self-awareness inside myself. So when I was sitting with Patrick, I had a whole lot of conversations inside myself. Some parts of me found it very hard to be there. So I was listening to myself while I was listening to Patrick.
Michael, you write about what you call the inappropriate conversation, which is a term for reconciliation when it is experienced as a way to overlook pain or ignore problems or deny patterns of injustice. What corrective would you offer to anyone who thinks of reconciliation in this way?
Yeah, I think I'd say we got to dream bigger. The language of inappropriate conversation came from it's like page 2 of the book, is the very first chapter, and I had written to a Palestinian woman, a professor who was in the West Bank, and said, "I'd like to talk to you about the kind of peace process, the reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians, and hear your thoughts." And she wrote back just this one line that said, "This is an inappropriate conversation. We're being occupied. So if we're going to talk, we're going to talk about justice." And so it set up this tension between the idea of justice and the idea of reconciliation. And what do these things mean? And the theme that emerged throughout the whole trip that I was on throughout these countries was that reconciliation becomes a real problem when we think of it only in terms of, oh, if we could just get along, or if we can just sit down and have a conversation, everything will be fine. And that's the end of the imagination. And that it becomes an inappropriate conversation when we don't see that process, that dialogue process, the process of trust, of learning to rehumanize each other. If we don't see that as actually a carrier toward a more free society, a more just society, then it can actually be part of the problem. And so I think what I encourage people to do is to see justice and reconciliation as in a really intimate partnership together. Because if we deal with things of reconciliation, what we might talk about with building trust and dialogue and coming to see the humanity of each other, the quality of our relationship, that's never going to be sustainable if we continue to have systems and structures and institutions and processes that are actually benefiting some of us, but not all of us, that are putting some of us above the others, that are creating imbalances in power. Reconciliation is the process of learning to live together well with those we find difficult to live well with. And so I think justice is a way. We cannot live together well with people when there are massive imbalances in power and access to resources and all these things. So if reconciliation doesn't have in its imagination the importance of dealing with those, then it actually, I think, can create more harm than good.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add something to that? Also, that I wouldn't have met Patrick for the second time if he wasn't open to hearing the impact of his actions on me, and that was really, really important. And when I bring people together who've been hurt or there's been some conflict, I have to make sure that they can hear the impact of the other person's behavior. Otherwise, as you said, it can do more harm. So we have to be very, very careful. People are ready to hear the impact, and quite often that people find that very, very hard. But it's really painful if someone's been through, abuse or trauma, if the person won't actually take any responsibility and won't hear the impact of their actions. That has to be a crucial ingredient of these difficult conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That makes me wonder, something that I thought about as I was reading your story in particular in this book is what steps can be taken toward peace if one side is still actively harming or even just wishing harm to the other. Is it possible to begin that process if both sides don't yet possess the qualities that, Joe, you identify as being necessary for reconciliation, which are empathy, trust, curiosity, respect, self-awareness, autonomy, and commitment? Can you make peace if you're the only side willing peace?
I mean, I feel I'm quite lucky in a way that I've got a name of someone who killed my dad. A lot of people around the world don't know, or it wouldn't be appropriate. So in some ways, it really is never going to happen, that reconciliation, for so many reasons. But I think what we can do is transform our own pain, our own trauma. Even if we're waiting for justice, we can still heal. And quite often I've seen people around the world, what they do is they turn their pain into some kind of action. And it's always going to be different. Something that's going to bring something positive out of it. And that's one way of healing. I work a lot with victims of new terrorism in this country. Unfortunately, we've got a lot. And it's about making sure everyone has the right support. We know a lot about the effects of trauma on the body now. And I think we really need to make sure everybody has access. If they've been through abuse, if they've been through injustice, if they've been through any kind of appalling violence, they've got access to support to the right kind of trauma therapy. But certainly we don't need to stay connected to the person who's hurt us forever, because I feel that's like a kind of double pain. We're hurt first of all, and then we're hurt because that person is still in our head. So we need our perpetrator, the person who's abused us, or whether it's an injustice, we need to get them out of our heads and find a way to turn it around. And for that, we need support, we need love, we need the right kind of therapy.
Yeah, and just to add, there's a really helpful saying that trauma that is not transformed is transferred. So when trauma is experienced, it's like the law of energy. It's neither created nor destroyed. It's only transferred. And this is what happens with trauma. When it hits us, if we don't find a way to turn that energy into something that can help us, then we will simply dish it out to the next place or next person that we meet. And so I think Joe is right. Like, part of what we have to do in those situations, one, is make sure that the harm, we remove ourselves from the harm, whether that's we find a way to stop the harm from happening or we simply get out. So I think that's really important, is to look after our own safety and our own well-being. But it's one of the limits of peacemaking and reconciliation is that you can't reconcile with someone who's unwilling to reconcile with you. Like, it's a two-way street, and this is how marriages end, right? One person may really, really want it, but the other doesn't. The marriage is over. And so you can forgive someone who doesn't want your forgiveness, who doesn't want to reconcile. That is possible, but you can't actually reconcile with somebody and develop a relationship of mutuality if they're not also willing. In national politics, you might hear people talk about, we don't have a partner for peace, right? That's what that's about. In order for there to be a sustainable peace, you need a partner. It's all about building partnerships. So without that willingness from the other side, your willingness will only get you so far. And I think that's where you have to do what Joe's talking about, cultivate that strong foundation on your shore, so that hopefully once the other has made ready theirs, then you can actually meet across the bridge.
Yeah, and I guess, like, try and not blame a community or a group of people or a country or a community, because that, I think, delays our healing. The longer that we make other people the reason why we're hurting, why our life is difficult, that delays our own recovery. So we have to take responsibility for our emotions. We're not responsible for the injustice that happens to us, or mainly not, but we are totally responsible for our emotions. So the things we can do when we own them, we can feel them, we can express them, we can be creative. But the one thing that will just take away our humanity is if we put it out there and go, it's all your problem. And it's so easy to do as well.
Yes.
I feel when I'm hurting, go, oh my God, who am I going to blame? Whether it's the person in the car who's just almost like cut me up, or they're just those moments where I still want to blame someone. So that's why it's such difficult work to change that blame response.
A lot of what we're talking about right now, and especially because the nature of your story, Joe, relates to, as you said, somebody whose name somebody whose face somebody who it makes it easier to humanize him as a person because he's an individual person who now you have a relationship with. How is that process of making peace to heal an emotional or spiritual injury from someone who has personally wounded you different than making peace to heal wounds that are systemic or cultural or national? Are those, in fact, two separate processes, or are they related?
Michael, you going first, or shall I?
No, go right ahead.
Okay.
I'm happy
Well, that's
to
a
listen.
massive question. That's such a really important question. And I like to make things quite simple and see what I can do. So at the moment, I'm working a lot with young people in my country who are demonized. So in the 60s, 70s, all Irish were demonized and all blacks. Now it's a lot of Muslims are demonized and seen as less than human. And I work with these amazing girls who every day experience racism. Now I can't change the people who are racist towards them. I can't change the institution, but what I can do is be a safe space for them to share with me their daily experiences and empower them to become positive change makers. That's the work that I do. And I remember the first time one of them said to me, it's the first time that a white person has not just listened to me, but believes in me, which is kind of heartbreaking, but also very, very moving. And I take that responsibility hugely. I take that, like, to me, it's the almost most important work I've done. And I'm going back, if we probably, like you, I never know what's happening in terms of our freedom to travel at the moment, but I'm hopefully going to see them in a couple of weeks. And I'm going to create a safe place for them to share with me what it's been like for them. They're living in an area where there's definitely more hatred, more hate crimes, for them to share. So that's something I can do. Now, if I had more power, I'm very grassroots, but then I could challenge perhaps more. Maybe my book will be able to do that. I don't know. But I take responsibility. And as a white person, I see what my people are doing to impact on those that aren't white. So I take the privilege that I know I have and try to use that in the best way that I can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that there's within the national collectives and nations, they're all made up of people, right? So there's not, in my mind, it's not completely divorced, the idea of what do we do on a national or macro level and what do we do on a micro level, because the macro is made up of all the micros. And so I think a lot of the things that are needed for people are to pursue this idea of reconciliation or peace building is and healing is, they need answers. They need an acknowledgement for the pain that's been caused of their own suffering. There's the importance of being able to cultivate empathy. There's the need to build trust. And these things all happen on macro levels as well within nations, that there's a need to be able to cultivate curiosity and trust in the people that you have othered, the people that you're afraid of, that you need on a large scale an acknowledgement of the pain that's been done. This has been really alive within Native American communities, an acknowledgement from the U.S. government of what has happened, what the U.S. government has done to that's still very much alive because it hasn't been settled in that way. And so I think on kind of large levels, you see the importance of things like museums and memorials and national commemorations to acknowledge not just, oh, this is the pain that you've experienced, but to be able to acknowledge our own shame and saying, this is the pain that we perpetuated. And I think that's a really important thing as well, is to be able to own our own responsibility in the harm that's been done to other people, whether as an individual or as a collective.
I just want to mention to folks who are watching and listening that you can submit questions in the chat, either on the app or on Humanity Tennessee's website. And so we've got just under 15 minutes left. And so I want to remind people to send in those questions now if you have something that you'd like to ask the author. And then I will continue with my questions. Joe, you say in your story, in Michael's book, Story Within a Story, that peace is about moving from where we have the enemy to actually seeing that there is no other. And that seems like it, in practice, could be quite a long process. And so I'm wondering for you personally, how long was it after you first met with Patrick in 2000 until you began to realize that, as you said, sometimes you travel to a location to speak and he's the only person there who you know. He teaches you about his crossword puzzles that he does, and you begin to realize this person is my friend. How long was it between that initial meeting when you met him face to face for the first time and this realization that you have a strange friendship with this man who is responsible for your father's death?
At the first meeting, I shared a poem that I'd written for him. And it was a poem where I imagined meeting him. It was called Bridges Can Be Built. And I think it was one of the things that really helped him to move from justification and righteousness to being very vulnerable. And it said in that poem, everything I still believe. In the poem, it was about, I acknowledge your suffering. And understanding his own story, because I knew before I met him that when he was 6, 7, 8 years old, he didn't grow up thinking, I want to kill. what I didn't know is when he was 15 that he was actually committed to non-violence and following Martin Luther King. So that was there before the meeting. But then the friendship took quite a few years, because also I felt like if I said in public, he's my friend, that felt quite scary to me, and I wasn't ready for that. And I was always super aware of my own siblings and my family, and it's been a balancing act of not wanting to upset or re-traumatize them, whilst also wanting to make a stand for peace. And it's been tricky managing those different parts. So when I got to say, I mean, I don't know when it was, it might have been 5 years later, I said, yes, he is my friend. It is an unusual friendship. And we've actually had the longest time that we haven't seen each other because of COVID. We had a lot of talks planned, and I was going to have some events for the 20th anniversary of us meeting. I wanted to mark it because it seemed to me 20 years is such a long time. And I think if someone said to me at the first meeting, you'll still be seeing him in 20 years, I would have run to the other side of the world. It was too terrifying. But here we are after 20 years, and he's written his book. And I feel a little bit cross in myself that he got his done first. And he's had to delay the publishing date of his. And so I really want to get mine out, but I haven't seen him since last year. And normally I see him every 2 or 3 months, and we've had to cancel so many things. And I miss the conversations that we have, but they're not always easy. Sometimes I've gone, okay, that's it, I'm going to take a break. It can still be challenging. And of course, I've always got the right to walk away, as does he.
Just the fact that you can even say, though, that you miss conversations with Patrick is just a remarkable sentence to be able to utter, Christy, do we have time for me to add something to that, or do we need to move on?
Sure. No, please.
Okay. You were just talking about how long a process it is, and it reminds me that there's a theory in peace building that it can take as long to get out of a conflict as it took to get in it. So in recovery circles, 12-step circles, they say if you go 20 miles into the woods, you got to go 20 miles back out, right? So you don't spend 20 years learning a behavior, learning a way of thinking, and then suddenly you're out of it in a year. It's a very long process. And I have found that really helpful in the ways that, at least in a kind of a national level, you think about here in the US, the way that people are just thinking, can we just be done with race? Like, come on. We have the Civil Rights Act. Obama was president twice. Race is a thing of the past. Like, we've been saying that for a while. And it's been helpful for me to think, well, if we just think about even race as a conflict in the United States, if you just want to put it in those terms, and say it started in 1619 with the arrival of the first kidnapped Africans until the signing of the Civil Rights Agreement, I think it's like 345 years. It's something around those. So we're only, if we were in the post-conflict stage, we're like 50 years into a very long journey. Which can be, that can lead us to despair if we're not careful. But what it helps me do is to not get so premature in my announcements of everything is settled, and to just say these things take a long time. We have been conditioned in ways of thinking about the other. We have been conditioned in the stories that we associate with the others. And it takes a very long time to unlearn those and to begin to tell new stories and to begin to develop new emotional reactions to things. And so there's a certain amount of patience that's really needed as we walk these long journeys.
We've got a question from somebody in the audience. They say, your stories demonstrate the potential impact of empathy. How does empathy come to be so devalued between groups and individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think President Obama, actually before he was president, he gave a speech, I think it was in 2004. I can't remember exactly when it was, but he actually talked about how the empathy deficit was more severe than the federal deficit. And the former Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, talked about the empathy gap and the importance of that. And I think there is this general awareness. I've been seeing it on Facebook a lot and Instagram, just being like, man, we have no ability to empathize with each other anymore. That as our fear increases, so does our distance from the other, and the way that we try to reduce them to these really unnuanced and uninteresting stories. and that what is needed is a way of cultivating an imagination to say that there's likely a lot that I don't know. To imagine that they actually might be, we could be them in the same circumstances. Joe was saying, to be able to think, actually, had I grown up in Belfast and had the same encounters with British Army or with police that Pat had, I might have been led to do the same thing. I mean, that's a remarkable thing to say, and I think those are the things that we are not always good at, is surrendering this idea of the moral high ground in this way. Like, we imagine, oh no, we have it figured out, what we think is right, and there's no other way to think about it. But that way of thinking doesn't actually lead us to a place where we can live well with people that we find difficult to live with. And so this process of empathy is the process of imagining, of dethroning ourselves from the center of the world and letting somebody else's story and their personhood actually take center stage for a bit. Yeah, so I'll end there so Joe can say a word.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think with the media, it's very quick to quickly find out who has the moral high ground and to make out they're the baddies, and the whole idea of the goodies and baddies is getting more and more extreme. And sometimes people even say that empathy is not helpful because they think empathy is just for like our own people. But I call it unbounded empathy. It's empathy for absolutely everyone. And the other day, it was back in May, my daughter was attending in London Black Lives March, and she was in the park afterwards, and these guys started running towards her, and they're very drunk. They're about age 40, all white, and almost attacked her. But the police came at the same time, and these are a new kind of far right group in England. And I completely felt my moral righteousness. I was angry, and I was like, how dare they? And because it was my daughter, and I was so proud that she'd gone, and then so angry with them, and that's when I realized, actually, I need to get curious. Why did these men come that day? What are their stories? And I'm working towards finding a way of having dialogue with those that are quite hard for me not to have that moral high ground. And so this is where the self-awareness is got to be there, because it doesn't mean we can't challenge their behavior. Yes, we have to challenge their behavior, but not by making them less than human. And there's a difference.
That's crucial. Michael, I have one last quick question for you, and then I think you had a reading that you wanted to finish us off with. Someone else in the audience has asked, how many stories are included in your book?
Really 10, I guess. I mean, there are some 10 chapters, and in maybe one or two, I tell a couple of stories within that, but most chapters just focus on sort of a one person story like Joe. The trip that I took, though, I interviewed around 70 people, and so I had all of these stories, and so that's a really difficult part in the writing process, is deciding what gets in and what doesn't, because I don't think y'all were going to read a 500-page book, and so there are 10 stories that are left in there, and so to transition, do you want to, Christy, do you have something to say before I read this last section?
Oh, well, sure. I was just going to let folks know that if you want to find out more about either Michael or Joe, you can find Michael online at either michaelmcray.com or at Michael T. McRay on Facebook and Instagram. You can find out more about Joe's organization at buildingbridgesforpeace.org. And also to remember that the link to purchase Michael's book and other books through Parnassus is in the chat if you want to follow through here at the end of our session.
And so the book is amazing. I thoroughly recommend it. And I know that it's going to just spread to so much understanding and empathy and help. So thank you, Michael, for your amazing book.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks for letting me tell your story in there. And be sure to look out for Joe's book when it comes out as well. And the book is also on Audible if you want to listen to an audio copy, so that's available as well. So I thought to end, I would just read something from the last page of the book. It's in the final chapter called Cracks of Hope, where I tell the story of two men, Rami El-Hanan and Bassam Aramin. Rami is an Israeli father whose daughter Smedar was killed by a Palestinian suicide bomber in Jerusalem. And Bassam Aramin is a Palestinian man whose daughter Abir was shot in the back of the head when she was 10 by an Israeli soldier on her way home from school. Some of you might know their stories from a brand new novel called A Paragon by Colin McCann. That's a new best-selling novel. You can check that out. But incredible stories of these two men who have used the nuclear power of their grief as a way of working toward some kind of shared future together, and to say that we who have paid the highest price possible actually are the ones who are in the best position to make peace. And so I want to read this last section. Today, Rami is the Israeli leader and Bassam the Palestinian leader of the Parent Circle Families Forum. Both men lost what is unbearable to lose. Rami is a former Israeli soldier whose daughter was murdered by a Palestinian combatant. Bassam is a former Palestinian combatant whose daughter was murdered by an Israeli soldier. In the world of war, these two have every reason to hate each other. Their grief could drive them toward vengeance. But their 8th day has come as it comes for us all. We are left with our grief and a decision. What will we do with our pain? This question is where Rami and Bassam live their lives. Day after day, they choose again, and instead of reaching for a gun, they reach for one another. Theirs are stories that might save us. Like all the stories I met along the way, Rami and Bassam's tell me that in the violence of conflict, we may well have every reason to hate each other, because enemies do exist. Fear is real, and the worst pain we can imagine may find us at any time. And their stories tell me that we can find a way out, that we can do better than a world with enemies, that courage can accompany fear, and that the worst pain we can imagine has the possibility of leading us to a world beyond violence. Thank you all very much for your time today. And Joe, thank you so much. Christy, thanks for hosting this.
Great to talk to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.